Hear me okay?
Yes.
Cool. I also figured out how to view the chat. I feel so technologically savvy while displaying my slides. So if you have questions and there's going to be a few case questions, feel free to use the chat to make this a little more interactive. So today I'm going to be talking about vaping-associated lung injury. My only disclosure is that I guarantee I'm going to lady at least once while talking about this. So look forward to that entertainment, but otherwise, no disclosures. So let's start with a clinical case. This is a patient who actually came and saw me in clinic. So he's a 25-year-old man with PTSD and tobacco use who presents to clinic and says, "Hey doc, I've started vaping to try and quit smoking. I usually only juice, but I've used wax once in a while. What are your thoughts?" And so I want you guys to think to yourself what in your first gut reaction you would have with this patient. Feel free to answer in the chat if you're feeling brave. So A, I feel totally comfortable discussing the risks and benefits of vaping. B, I can make some limited comments about vaping, but I don't know much. C, I have no idea what half of those words you just used mean. And full disclosure, I was solidly a C, and we had a little bit of some translation happening. I see some B's and some mixed B's and C's. So my goal for you guys is to shift the curve a little bit. So maybe we have some more A's, some more B's, and we can translate so we're all able to talk in the same language with our patients. So here's my objectives. First, I'm going to define e-cigarette history, anatomy, and terminology so we can all use the same language when talking to people who vape. And then I'm going to describe the clinical history and underlying pathophysiology of volley. And then finally, I'm going to review the use of e-cigarettes and its relation to smoking cessation. So let's get started with some history. So it turns out that actually vaping and e-cigarettes first became available in China in 2003. And then they expanded and became available to the US and European markets in 2006. So it's actually been around for quite some time. In 2009, there was the passage of the Tobacco Control Act, which gave the FDA authority to regulate manufacturing, distribution, and marketing of tobacco products. Now, this explicitly included cigarettes, roll your own tobacco, smokeless tobacco, but it didn't explicitly state e-cigarettes. So in 2014, the company Juul was founded. This was one of the first US-based companies, and they were really aggressive in their marketing towards kind of a modern method of smoking and really targeted a younger crowd. And then in 2016, the Tobacco Control Act expanded to explicitly cover e-cigarettes. And then that brings us to 2019, which was our first case of smoking associated, or excuse me, e-cigarette associated vaping lung injury. So a little bit on the history of its use. So every few years, the CDC surveys a large portion of US high school students to talk about or assess their smoking use, vaping use, alcohol, and sexual history to kind of see where US teens are. And so in 2011, they sent out a survey and asked students, in the last 30 days, how many of you have vaped? And in 2011, only 1.5% of high school students said they had vaped in the last 30 days. At that time, it was actually also reported that about 16% of high school students had smoked traditional cigarettes in the last 30 days. And then in 2018, that survey was sent again, And now the number of students who said they had vaped in the last 30 days increased to almost 21%, compared to only 6% of students who said they had smoked cigarettes in the last 30 days. So between 2011 and 2018, there was a huge increase in high school students who were vaping. And just a note, that expansion of the Tobacco Control Act to cover e-cigarettes is still having ongoing litigation, predominantly pushed by Juul. Their argument is that they are a smoking cessation tool and shouldn't be regulated under that act. And so there's still some legal drama going on with the regulation of e-cigarettes. So let's talk about types of e-cigarettes. There's a variety. The first generation of e-cigarettes were the disposable e-cigarettes. And so these were one-time use. You couldn't modify them or open them up, and they've kind of fallen out of favor. Then there's the rechargeable e-cigarettes that have charging points and ports and USB inserts, as well as these pre-contained pods that contain vaping material that you just insert into your vape pen as a little cartridge. And then there's also tank devices. These, the user fills on their own with whatever they're going to vape. And then there's also e-pipes and e-cigars. I'm not sure if these are actually in use or if it's just something that the CDC has on their website. But really, no matter what they're using, except for the disposable e-cigarettes, the basic anatomy is the same. So there's a mouthpiece, also called a drip tip, I learned. And then there's a battery and plus or minus a USB charging port. And then there's a holding tank. And whether this tank is a pre-filled insertable cartridge or something that the users fill on their own, it can vary depending on what e-cigarette they're using. But in the holding tank, you place whatever you're gonna vape, and then there's also a heating coil. And this heating coil is made up of mixed metals containing things like cobalt, and that heating coil heats up and vaporizes whatever's in the holding tank. So what actually goes in the holding tank? Let's talk about it and maybe do a little bit of translation. So there are two kind of types of vaping concentrate. There's juice or liquid, or e-juice, e-liquid, or there's resin or wax. Now, the resin and wax can be called a huge number of different names depending on the consistency, things like sap or shatter, snap and pull. All of these refer to the same type of thing, just a different consistency. So let's talk about what's actually in them. So in the juice, it's made up of propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, nicotine, liquid nicotine, and liquid flavoring. Now, these are often advertised as safe because they're food grade, but the important thing to note is that when things are tested for food grade safety, it's tested for safety for ingestion, not for inhalation. So with e-juice, it's often commercially available, and this is what you'll have in the pre-filled cartridge. And these commercially available liquids are often advertised as safe because they have food grade quality, but again, that doesn't correlate to safety of inhalation. Despite them being available commercially, there's also a ton of recipes online for people to make their own. And these liquids can contain nicotine or THC actually. But typically when people are talking about juice, they're referring to nicotine, and usually they're referring to commercially bought either pre-filled cartridges or liquid that they've bought from a supplier. That's contrasting with resin or wax, and this is talking about a THC containing solid or semi-solid concentrate. And this is typically made at home from heating or actually from cooling marijuana. And again, there's a ton of step-by-step instructions and recipes to make it at home. here in Washington State, where we have dispensaries, there are dispensaries that are selling different resins, but there's a number of different suppliers as well. But often people are making this at home. An important thing to know is that resin can be cut with vitamin E. The consistency of vitamin E is that kind of the perfect consistency to cut resin and stretch it, but it's not used in liquid or juice. So that was kind of like a breeze through on terminology, history, and kind of what people are putting in their vape pens. Are there any questions so far before we move on? Okay, cool. It looks like Sarah answered some questions about terminology. So let's move on. Oh, my own naive question. Why take and turn it into vaping instead? So that is a great question. There's a couple things. One, people argue that you get a more concentrated THC, and so you get a kind of a better experience. The other is that it's a little more portable, more subtle, able to vape in more places than maybe you can smoke marijuana. And it's just, some people just like it better, but they advertise a better experience. Any other questions? Does the wax go directly into the chamber, or do you reheat it? Yeah, it can go directly into the chamber. And it's, the term wax is a little misleading. It's more of a semi-solid, so it's malleable, but it typically goes directly into the chamber. Some people will reconstitute it with like other flavors, but it goes directly in the chamber. Okay, cool. Let's move on to the kind of the meat of our talk and talk about vaping associated lung injury. So if you guys can all remember back before a time of coronavirus, when there was another sensational lung disease that was hitting the headlines of popular news, this was kind of a huge deal, and this big mystery and unknown that kind of kicked off our academic year. So vaping associated lung injury was actually just first identified in March 2019, with a dramatic rise in number of cases, with a peak in September of 2019. And by the peak of this outbreak, every single state in the US, as well as territories, had at least one case. So it was a rapid rise and spread rapidly, and it was this big unknown. So what is it? What's the definition? Well, it's actually pretty simple, and there's really only 3 components to define vaping-associated lung injury. So first of all, people, to get a VALI diagnosis, have had to use an e-cigarette within the last 90 days of symptom onset. And it's important to know that this can be either a THC product or a nicotine product. VALI has been identified in both users. The next part for the definition is you have to have bilateral pulmonary infiltrates on chest imaging, whether that's X-ray or CT, it doesn't matter, but it has to be present. And then finally, there has to be an absence of pulmonary infection or other plausible diagnosis. So it's essentially a diagnosis of exclusion. So for example, a person with heart failure who's coming in with heart failure exacerbation and has bilateral infiltrates, who happens to vape, does not get the diagnosis of VALI because there's a more plausible cause for their presentation. So that is the simple definition. And using this definition, there's been a lot of publications looking retrospectively at those with the diagnosis of VALI. So this is a cohort that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine of looking at 98 patients I believe in Illinois and Wisconsin, who ended up being diagnosed with VOLI, and these were their presenting symptoms. So not surprisingly, 97% of those who presented had some sort of respiratory symptom. Now, whether that was dyspnea or cough and chest pain, it kind of varied, but most of them had respiratory symptoms. Surprisingly to me, there was actually a large percentage of patients who presented with GI symptoms. And in this cohort, 77% of patients had concomitant GI symptoms, but in another case of about 60 patients in Utah, they had upward of 90% of their patients with GI symptoms, which I thought was pretty surprising. And then 100% of patients presented with constitutional symptoms. And this symptomatic breakdown was pretty similar throughout the separate cohorts, both in Utah, and there was another study done in California, and the symptom breakdown was pretty similar. Now, as far as vital signs on presentation with this same New England Journal cohort from Illinois and Wisconsin, there was a little more variability. Almost 60% were actually febrile, over 80% were tachycardic, and 70% were tachypnic. And in this cohort, over 50% were hypoxemic with a saturation on presentation less than 88%. But this actually was pretty variable among the different cohorts that were evaluated. So the breakdown of vital sign abnormalities was much less reliable between different groups that were looked at. But remember, the definition of VOLI does not include vital signs as part of the syndrome. It's not a diagnostic criteria. It's symptoms, and then use of a vape pen, and then the bilateral infiltrates. So looking at these bilateral infiltrates, here's an example case from a 17-year-old male who presented with dyspnea, and this was his admission chest x-ray. And it showed bilateral hazy opacities, kind of mid-lung fields to basilar lung fields, that met criteria of VOLI. So he was admitted, he was hypoxemic, and ended up actually in the ICU. 12 hours after he was admitted, they got a repeat chest x-ray, and it showed pretty dramatic progression of his infiltrates. And you can see he has some pretty impressive air bronchograms, all pointing to his worsening pulmonary alveolar filling process. And this patient actually ended up getting a CT at that time as well. And here it just really nicely demonstrates that he had pretty significant burden of disease with a lot of ground glass alveolar filling. In this particular patient, some may notice that he has sort of some peripheral sparing, but there's no specific pattern of the bilateral infiltrates that's pathognomonic to VOLI. You just have to have something on both sides of your lungs on your imaging. So that's kind of a summary of what these patients look like when they're presenting. Let's talk a little bit about the treatment that they received. So now, since this was a new entity, there is clearly no randomized control trials for treatment for these patients. And it's all just retrospective look of what was done to help support them. And so because of that, there was a lot of variability in treatment. But most people, at least initially, got antibiotic coverage. It often was just cap coverage with like ceftriaxone and azithro or doxy. Some did get vanc and pip/tazo initially, but most people who got antibiotics ended up having them removed after 48 hours of negative cultures, but there was antibiotic coverage. And then individuals got steroids, and there's been a whole discussion on the use of steroids in ARDS. but some patients were given steroids. Now, there weren't enough to look at if there was a trend towards better outcomes. And again, this wasn't a randomized control trial. But one thing that everyone did get was ARDS care. So that was low tidal volume, some got proned, some got neuromuscularly blocked, and then some patients actually did end up on ECMO. And really that was just the summary of the treatment. It was really aggressive supportive ARDS care. And it looks like Lauren asked that it seems to present similarly to ARDS, and did anyone look at the P to F ratios? Yes, they did, and it's like you knew what I was going to talk about. They did end up just getting pretty aggressive ARDS care, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of clinical outcomes and their PDFs in a little bit. So that was the treatment. Let's talk about clinical outcomes. So first, let's look at kind of one of the biggest cohorts from Illinois, Wisconsin that we already talked about. Of the cases identified, 95% were hospitalized. So I think it's interesting that there were some that were able to be sent home, because I think when this was splashed across the news, it was billed as people were dying as soon as they started vaping. So that was interesting. Of those hospitalized, however, 56% were admitted to the ICU. And of those in the ICU, almost half ended up intubated. And of those intubated, like Lauren asked, almost half of those met the Berlin criteria for ARDS, and their average P to F ratios was about 130, so kind of moderate ARDS, moderate to severe. And in this cohort of almost 100 patients, of those on ARDS, 2 actually ended up on ECMO, and 1 of those patients died. Now, this percentage breakdown of those admitted to the ICU and intubated actually was, again, pretty similar among hospital systems that retrospectively looked at their cases. Now, for kind of the US numbers, the total number of cases we've recorded is 2,807 cases with 68 deaths. Now, this is with a huge asterisk that the CDC stopped recording cases in March of 2020 with the rise of coronavirus, because they obviously had a little bigger fish to fry. So these numbers are just through February 2020, and there's no data on the ongoing burden of disease. So it's really, we have no idea if people are still presenting with this. Understandably, there's a little bit of distraction. So let's see, we can get into the pathophysiology unless there's some questions. Oh, it looks like Ryan says, the definition includes exposure to e-cigarettes within the last 90 days, but is there any other information about the timing between vaping and presentation? Do those who are long-term smokers still present with volley? Example, years later. So that is kind of unknown. Most people who presented had reported vaping within the last few days. It was a little hard to tease out because a lot of this was retrospective, but there were some cases of they had been vaping and then had increasing dyspnea and so stopped vaping a few days before presentation. And it looks like there were people who had been vaping for a number of at least months before they ended up presenting with volley. Did that answer your question, Ryan? Cool. Okay. Let's talk about the pathophysiology. Why do we think this is actually happening? And I'm sure some of you may have heard about this vitamin E situation. So, as I talked about, vitamin E is sometimes used to cut THC products. And a study looking at patients diagnosed with confirmed volley patients underwent bronchoscopy with BAL. They looked at 51 volley patients. and 48 of those had vitamin E on their BAL. And this was compared to healthy non-users, healthy e-cigarette users, and cigarette smokers. Those control groups, none of them had vitamin E. And so it's thought that this might be the culprit. Now, why does vitamin E cause volley? Well, there's two proposed mechanisms. So first, if you guys remember about surfactant, all the way back to med school when we talked about surfactant, and how it helps reduce the surface tension in your alveoli, making nice compliant lungs that you can breathe nice and easily. Super important. Well, it turns out when surfactant is exposed to vitamin E, it changes from its nice gel form to a liquid crystalline phase, resulting in pretty dense lungs that don't expand very easily. So this is thought to be one way that vitamin E is contributing to volley presentation. The other way is that when you combust vitamin E, it actually produces ketene molecules, and these molecules are super reactive. So they generate a lot of free radicals and they scavenge nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is super important for the vascular regulation in your lungs. And so all of this results in endothelial dysfunction of your lungs. And so that is the thought behind how vitamin E leads to volley. Now, if you remember, I told you guys that vitamin E is only used to cut THC products, but we've seen volley in patients who use only nicotine vape solutions as well. So there's another theory on how those who only vape nicotine products end up with volley, and that's the substance called acrolein. So it's produced from combustion of the glycerol, and glycerol is a major component in vaping juice. So this is a nasty little molecule, and it's been identified in dysregulation of a ton of different pathways. One of which is the FOXO3 neurosignaling pathway, and through a bunch of complicated signals that I do not understand, this upregulation leads to endothelial dysfunction. Acrolein itself is also, again, super reactive and increases free radicals and scavenges nitric oxide, leading to more endothelial dysfunction. And it also causes a ton of oxidative stress. And this triggers our little macrophages to make IL-6 and systemic inflammation, leading to more endothelial dysfunction. And so that's the theory of how both those who use THC products and those who use nicotine products can both end up with vaping-associated lung injury. Turns out, though, that vaping has been linked to other lung diseases. That's not just volley. So there's been case reports of pneumoconiosis associated with vaping. And this is secondary to cobalt inhalation from the heating coil. So with the repeated heating of that heating coil, folks are inhaling cobalt, and it looks exactly like borreliosis. And this has actually been confirmed on lung biopsy. So pretty impressive pneumoconiosis has been seen. There's also been cases of inflammatory lung disease. So hypersensitivity pneumonitis, eosinophilic pneumonia, and diffuse alveolar hemorrhage have also been seen and attributed to vaping. And then there's inhalational injuries. So folks have been found to have pneumothoraces, pneumomediastinum, and then there's been burns from, particularly from modified vape pens. So people have had inhalational burns, but also facial burns, as well as burns in their hands. Some modifications have led to exploding devices, particularly, so it can be pretty dangerous. So that was kind of a big broad overview of volley and a small run through of other vaping related lung diseases. Are there any questions? Cool. All right. Last but not least, let's talk about e-cigarettes and smoking cessation. So our same patient saying, yeah, we know cigarettes are bad for you, so why not do what I can to quit them right now, and I'll try to cut down on vaping next. I don't modify my vape pen, so I'm not worried. And this is a direct quote from him. I actually went back and looked at my notes because I remember being very panicked trying to counsel this patient that I knew very little about. So think to yourself, what do you think? What's your gut reaction on vaping and tobacco use? Is there A, limited data on e-cigarettes and vaping and smoking cessation? B, the use of e-cigarettes reduces total tobacco product consumption? Or C, e-cigarettes leads to dual consumption of tobacco and vaping? So you can kind of think to yourself, what's your gut tell you? And then we'll learn together. So it turns out there's actually been quite a bit of data looking at the use of vaping as a possible smoking cessation aid. And there's a little bit of mixed reviews. Ironically, a huge study came out February 2019 in the New England Journal of Medicine, just a month before the first case of volley was identified. That showed increased successful quit rates when compared to nicotine, traditional nicotine replacement products. So what they did is they took patients in the UK who were actively seeking smoking cessation therapy and randomized them to using a vape pen versus using traditional nicotine replacement. And they saw improved quit rates among those randomized to the vape pen. So this was billed as kind of the big change in smoking cessation, and a lot of the vaping companies kind of really latched on, and this got a lot of publicity that ended up having interesting timing right before the first cases of volley. So that was kind of the biggest positive pro vaping study, but there's actually way more data that suggests possible negatives. So one study saw increased relapse rates among those who used vaping as a smoking cessation aid compared to those with traditional nicotine replacement. Additionally, another trial saw that people who had quit smoking and then started vaping had increased relapse rates, even among those who had been abstinent for a long period of time. So they had seen people who had been abstinent from cigarettes for a number of years start vaping again and then go back and return to cigarettes. Another trial saw increased dual consumption, so people would quit for a period of time and then continue vaping and then return to cigarettes and vaping. They also have shown that people who start vaping are more likely to start smoking cigarettes in conjunction, even if they had never smoked previously. And there was a trial that showed increased frequency of use. So people who were smoking, say, a half a pack a day were, when they transitioned to vaping, were consuming much higher rates of that, particularly since the levels of nicotine, it turns out, in vaping juice is very variable and can be much higher than it's actually listed. And there's an argument against the positive in that, as I think John mentioned, is that what was defined as successful quit rates were quitting of traditional cigarette smoking. It didn't mean quitting vaping. So a lot of these negative trials counted smoking cessation as stopping smoking traditional cigarettes as well as stopping vaping. But this positive New England Journal trial considered a success if they just stopped smoking cigarettes. So all that is to say that there's trend towards no benefit or actually harm, and there's a really significant risk of increased dual consumption if people are attempting to use vaping as a smoking cessation tool. And so the CDC does not recommend vaping as a smoking cessation aid, particularly given the risks associated with vaping itself. So just a little summary of all of the things we talked about. E-cigarettes are now modifiable, which can lead to specific complications. Vaping-associated lung injury is thought to be secondary to vitamin E acetate from THC products or from acrolein from nicotine products. E-cigarettes have been linked to other pulmonary diseases, particularly with modifications. And e-cigarettes have mixed results in smoking cessation with a trend towards dual consumption. And so that's all I have for you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
It's Russ here. Just kind of more of a comment. I sometimes still reserve e-cigarettes for terminal kind of like COPDers, end of the line harm reduction right at the end, once in a blue moon. I don't bring it up, but I say it's not wrong to if they choose to do that, because you can decrease cigarettes effectively for some.
Yeah, I think the problem with that a little bit is that there was a trial that I didn't particularly talk about that looked at the concentrations of nicotine in the vaping juice, and it showed that some of these concentrates include up to 20% nicotine and can lead to kind of upwards of 10-fold consumption. So people argue that with vaping, there's a tendency to actually have increased consumption. So there's a question of even if it's beneficial for harm reduction.
Alana, this was awesome. Thank you so much. Oh, it looks like Brandon just said something. Sorry, I have to start wrapping up, but.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Brandon, you're totally right. The concentration it can be super high. Some argue or advertise that it's the same concentration as a pack of cigarettes. But again, a lot of times the concentration on the label actually doesn't correlate to the concentration in the liquid. So people are tending to consume a lot more than they actually think they are. So yeah, that's a really good point, Brandon.
Any last questions before we take a bio break? Alana actually was so efficient. We were done with her session a little bit early. Oh, John's got a question. And Melissa.
Do you recommend any harm reduction to reduce value for those who are committed to vaping? That is a great question. Some people, and this is all kind of expert opinion, some people are recommending the kind of the pod pre-filled vaping pens like Juul because those are supposedly standardized. But I don't have a good sense of harm reduction. Quite honestly, I think it's my bias is I think it's harmful, and I think people end up using more than they think they are. So I don't have a great answer. If anyone does, let me know. And then let's say, do you know if there's any moves towards regulating the content of cigarettes or banning vitamin E? So it is, there's litigation still ongoing for the regulation of e-cigarettes, with a lot of companies really pushing that they're a smoking cessation tool. So they're trying to regulate The problem is that vitamin E is used to cut THC products, so they can't particularly regulate it from a federal level, considering that it's technically still illegal. And then the acrolein is a combustion product of glycerol, which is one of the main components of vaping liquid, so you can't really regulate it. So unfortunately, no, not really.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alana. You are fabulous as always. And it is 9:42. How about we take like a 5-minute stretch break while we get set up for Mary Davies, who is up next.